Welcome back for the start of the afternoon sessions. My name is Diane Barrans, and I'm the Alaska Commission on Postsecondary Education Executive Director, and in terms of full disclosure, I'm the Executive Officer of the Alaska Student Loan Corporation. In addition to providing outreach and early awareness services in Alaska, the Commission and Corporation jointly offer financial aid programs, including a state-based education loan program. So this is a topic that's very close to us as well. It is my pleasure today to introduce our moderator for the next session, in which we will focus on a matter of great importance to us all: college affordability and student debt. As the United States Undersecretary of Education for the last 3 years, Dr. Martha Cantor has overseen federal policies, programs and activities related to post-secondary education, adult and career technical education, federal student aid, and initiatives focused on several populations which have been historically underrepresented in post-secondary education, both in terms of access and success. The Undersecretary brings with her a rich academic and professional background, having taught, served as an administrator in policy and research, as well as for instruction and student services, and ultimately providing leadership first to California's De Anza College and then the Foothill De Anza Community College District, serving more than 45,000 students. As you can glean for yourselves from her full biography in the agenda packet, Martha Cantor has invested her entire professional life in endeavors directly impacted by and relevant to the topic at hand. Please join me in welcoming her here this afternoon.
It's great to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks, everyone. Can you see me? It's always my problem. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. I'd first like to, formally thank Diane for introducing me, and also a big round of thanks to Paul Lingenfelder and the SHIO folks for putting this on. I think the agenda is tremendous, so thank you, Paul, for having me and for all of us. So we have an hour and a half. We have 3 distinguished panelists and a respondent. I'll introduce them in a minute. And the way we're going to run this is I'll open with some framing comments, then I will turn to Kelly Edmiston, and I'll tell you a little bit about him, and then he'll turn to Michelle Casey. She'll take the podium, talk about her priorities and her information, and then she'll turn to David Bergeron, which will give you a federal perspective. And then after they're finished, Sandy Baum has come on board on the panel, and she'll respond to their comments. Then we'll take a breath, and I don't expect you to fall asleep. I know you've had a great lunch, but we're going to enter a Q&A session, and I'll kick off with a couple of questions, and then we'll open the floor. So that's how we're going to design this program, and I'll have to be the timekeeper to make sure that we have enough time to get to your questions. So be thinking about those questions. So first, let me tell you about the panelists. Dr. Kelly Edmiston, he's a senior economist in community development at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. He's been conducting research on regional economic growth and development, community development, consumer finance, and state and local public policy. He's published over 40 research articles, and he also serves as a policy advisor and gives technical assistance to different state and local governments, to companies and nonprofits, and he's often been a commentator on CNN, USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, and NPR, so he knows how to deal with media as well, and appreciate your being here. Before coming to the Federal Reserve Bank, he was an assistant professor of economics at the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University. So we have an expert, an economist, who also is releasing a report that I'm sure you'll get a copy of, which the title of which is Student Loans, Issues and Concerns. So you'll hear a lot from him. And following Dr. Edmiston, you'll hear from Michelle Casey. Michelle's going to tell us about her efforts in Illinois to protect consumers and the benefits of her participation on the wonderful Federal Negotiated Rulemaking Committee on Student Loans. Despite all the stress, and you heard from Marshall and others, about the rulemaking. This is one rulemaking where we achieved consensus. And so we were absolutely thrilled to be able to move ahead. She's the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of the Illinois Attorney General's Consumer Fraud Bureau. She investigates and prosecutes violations of the Consumer Fraud Act, the Mortgage Rescue Fraud Act, and the Illinois Fairness in Lending Act in a variety of areas, including mortgage lending and the for-profit schools industry. Michelle was selected as Assistant Attorney General Negotiator representing the people of the state of Illinois for the department's 2011 Negotiated Rulemaking Committee on the Student Loan Programs, and I'm sure you, as SHEOs, know all about that. She actually drafted and negotiated the proposed language. I think that's probably why we got consensus, Michelle. And now we're moving ahead to implement all of the updated regulations on student loans. It's going to help us a great, great deal. She advises the Attorney General on policy and legislative matters relating to student loan debt and the for-profit schools industry, as I said. Now, after Michelle talks, then you're going to hear from David Bergeron, my colleague. He's now the Acting Assistant Secretary of the Office of Postsecondary Education in our department, and he's going to talk about gainful employment and repayment plans as they relate to student loan debt. Before assuming this position in July, when Dr. Ochoa went to become the president of Cal State University, Monterey Bay, David was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy, Planning, and Innovation. And he directed the policy and budget development staff responsible for the program budget of the post-secondary education programs, including federal student aid, which is going to be generating more than $160 billion in student financial aid this fiscal year 2012. So it's an enormous responsibility. David oversees legislative, regulatory, and other policies affecting the department's post-secondary programs. And over the years, he reminded me he has worked on 5 reauthorizations of the Higher Education Act, the Taxpayer Teacher Relief Act, and numerous budget reconciliation acts. And we're waiting for our budget, as you know. We don't expect to have a budget till sometime this spring for this year. We'll be done with 2/3 of the year, but so it goes. He advises members of Congress. He advises all of us in the administration, the White House, and key policy stakeholders around the country, and oversees the processes and the approvals of a variety of the program regulations, the 13 program integrity rules being one example, and many other policy guidelines that you're implementing in your states and across the country. He also is working directly with institutions to a large degree, and as well as students and families. So it's a huge, huge job that he has. Before the department, coming to the department many years ago, he worked for a bank in consumer loans. So he's got some banking industry experience as well. And then finally, Sandy Baum is going to respond to the comments, this very rich discussion. Sandy is an independent higher education policy analyst and a consultant and a senior fellow at the George Washington School of Education and Human Development. And she's Professor Emerita of Economics at Skidmore College. She's written and spoken extensively on issues relating to college access, college pricing, student aid policy, student debt, affordability, and other aspects of higher education finance, and we talked a lot about that this morning. Dr. Baum is a senior associate at the Institute for Higher Education Policy in Washington and an affiliated consultant for HCM strategists. She's worked with many different organizations, including the Advisory Committee on Student Financial Assistance, the Association of Governing Boards, Canada's Student Loan Programs, the Jack Kent Cook Foundation, and NAFSFA, that's the Association of Financial Aid Administrators that most of your institutional staff belong to. She's managed and co-authored a variety of publications of note today: Trends in Student Aid, Trends in College Pricing. She's done those for the College Board since 2002. She's also developed and co-authored Education Pays, the Benefits of Higher Education for Individuals and Society for the College Board. And she co-chaired the Rethinking Student Aid Study Group, which issued a comprehensive set of proposals for reform back in the mid-2000s of the federal aid system. Here we are almost 10 years later, doing the same thing, trying to rethink student aid, trying to make it more productive, get more performance out of it, give it to students who actually are progressing in their programs. And she's done a lot of thinking about this, about simplification, you know, all the FAFSA simplification and other things we've done. Sandy's been a tremendous leader in that. Each of the panelists will talk to you for about 10 or 15 minutes, talking about the economic implications of student debt and the importance of consumer protection. So those are sort of the two parts of this. And Sandy Baum will then respond to what the panelists say, and I'll then do my best to provoke the panelists with a couple of questions to kick off the Q&A. So the importance of this topic, in our view, can't be overstated. Loan debt in this country for students has now surpassed both credit card debt and automobile loans. I know when you ask students, how are you paying for college, too many of them say, with my credit card, and then my private loan, and then maybe I knew about a federal loan or a state loan. So we have a huge amount of work to do. I think there's a new study that just came out from University of Wisconsin today. This is Sarah Goldrick-Robb, if you know her, at University of Wisconsin Higher Ed Policy, studied 3,000 students. Did they even know that they had a Pell Grant? Too many really didn't know. They knew it was helping. They got some federal money to go to college, but they didn't know what it was. So we've got a lot of financial literacy to do. Since the beginning, and I think you heard from Secretary Duncan and certainly, you know, Mayor Emanuel talking about our commitment to keep college affordable at the federal level. We're helping families and students make good choices. You'll see a lot about the financial aid shopping sheet that Secretary Duncan mentioned, and protecting consumers from waste, fraud, and abuse. That is really the menu of things that we are charged with doing. We've made the largest investment in student aid since the GI Bill. We've had big strides with working with Congress to get student aid passed every year, although we have seen a shaving off of different parts of that. And overall, the goal is to what I often call help the top 100% of Americans attend college. And I was, and not just some, and, you know, sort of the poignant, you know, the student who asked the question at the session before, you know, about how are we going to make sure that everyone really is going to have the opportunity. Over the past 10 years, the net price of college has risen by nearly 6% a year after inflation. In the last 3 years, though, because of the dramatic expansion of federal aid and the tax credits, you know, we don't talk enough about the American Opportunity Tax Credit, not enough Americans taking it, really have a lot more work today. Frankly, net tuition and fees, that is the price that is paid after financial aid, then the price is paid by students at public 2- and 4-year schools, has pretty much been flat over the last few years. But tuition has nevertheless increased to backfill the cuts that all of you are experiencing and around the country. When President Obama talked to high school students in Arlington, Virginia, he said, "This country has always made a commitment to put a good education within the reach of everyone who is willing to work for it. That's what makes us special. That's the kind of investment that we need to become first in the world in business and science and technology and medicine." And I know Carol Schneider's here. She'll also say that's also the kind of investment we need to have a country that has a vibrant democracy. We need civic leaders. We need informed thinkers. We need good people in the economy working at good jobs. And we need society that has the values that you attain when you learn to think critically in college. President said that's what made us an economic superpower. I won't go into all those things, but you've heard about the 2020 goal. Lumina Foundation calls it 2025. We say that's great. President said 2020. I work for the president. It's 2020 for me. We're going to try to reach that goal. It's really a stretch goal for us. I think C.C. Rouse, who's a professor of economics at Princeton, said it really well in 2009 when I came. It's an aspirational goal. It ought to be the goal for this country that we educate more Americans to the best of their ability. And the president did say that he really did have a vision of at least every American having 1 year of post-secondary education or training after high school, and more, from 43% now to over 60%. We really want to aim for that as being the 2020 goal or the 2025 goal, depending on who you talk to, of having an educated country of Americans who really can be the leaders of this and the next generation. Tony Carnevale's done tremendous work. You know, over 60% of jobs are going to require post-secondary education. The stakes are high. You heard Ram talk about, 20, well, he didn't say this, but a third of children aren't ready for kindergarten. So why are we surprised when we've got fourth grade reading at fourth grade levels that we have in this country? 25% of students not finishing high school, about half, or actually it's 58% now, are completing college, 58% of students completing college. We've got to get that other 42%, that other group, much, much higher. And these are first-time, full-time freshmen. You should be happy to know David Bergeron's leading this. We are going to be adding part-time and transfer students to our metrics. It's going to take a while, but thank you all for participating in those conversations. So we have a 2020 goal, and the group is going to talk about, how is the student loan and federal aid program impacting this goal in our future. We've got tremendous investments that we've made. You heard Ram talk about, or Secretary Duncan, going from 6 million to over 9.6 million students from the top 100% with a Pell Grant, graduating, going into, and hopefully graduating from college. We don't want to lose half of them along the way. So we've got to do a whole lot more throughout the country. Your leadership as SHIOs is essential to this equation of getting us to be a far more successful nation. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Kelly. He's going to tell you what he's learned in his report, and then we'll follow with Michelle and then David and Sandy. Thanks so much.
So I'm honored to, honored to be on a panel with these distinguished people, and I'm very happy to have an opportunity to present my recent work on student loans to SHIO, who I know there are a lot of very knowledgeable people in this group and people who care a lot about financial aid and student loans. Before I begin, as Martha said, I'm with the Federal Reserve, and some of you may be asking, why is the Federal Reserve talking about student loans? Well, actually, we have a much broader goal than what you might think. We focus a lot on macroeconomic policy and economic growth, but we want to make sure that everyone in America has an opportunity to enjoy the fruits of that growth. And so we have some focus on low and moderate income populations, for example, and I do some work in that area. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about education policy, so I'm doing this with kind of my consumer finance hat on more so than an education policy hat. But I also wanted to note that we have some flexibility to talk about our own views and do our own research, and this shouldn't be construed as a Federal Reserve position on anything. This is certainly should be thought about as my own views. I've written a report on student loans. It's called Student Loans Overview and Issues. It's actually not released yet. We have quite a thorough vetting process at the Federal Reserve, but it should, I'm hoping, in the next couple of weeks. That'll be on our website, so I hope some of you, if the talk today intrigues you, that you'll take a look at that. Some of the information in that report focuses on the market. It's a report for a broad audience, so it focuses on the student loan market and types of loans and that type of information. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk much about that today. I'm hoping that a lot of you, of course, in SHIO will be very familiar with that, so I don't want to be repetitive also. What I'm going to focus on is some new statistics that I've put in this report, and then I also want to talk a little bit about the fiscal impact of student loans, which there hasn't been a whole lot of analysis of that. There's been a lot of discussion about it, and in fact, I don't think a day's gone by since I've started thinking seriously about student loans that I haven't seen some kind of report in either the news media or from a policymaker talking about the crisis in student loans. And absolutely, for many individual borrowers, it's the worst kind of crisis. But the headline, I think, from my report is that it's probably not as big a crisis as it's made out to be. And the reason is, although there are a significant number of borrowers who are having a lot of trouble with this, and it is a problem, and we need to be thinking about that and addressing that problem. It's if we think about the typical student loan borrower, the situation's not as bad. And then the fiscal impact turns out to be, and this was somewhat to my surprise, less of a burden than we might think about. That doesn't mean these problems aren't going to explode sometime in the future, but for right now, I think maybe some of the reports we see are a little misleading. That's not the intention, but it kind of shows a scope of the problem that maybe isn't necessarily warranted. So what I want to do today, and I don't have a lot of policy prescriptions in this paper, it's basically to inform that debate. Since there are so many people out talking about this, so much information in the media, so many policymakers interested in this, I want to make sure that people who are talking about student loans, especially those who are designing policy around that, are fully informed about the issue. There are a couple of issues that get reported upon most. One is the debt and delinquency of individual borrowers, so I'm going to talk about that today and the fiscal impact. Another is the enormous growth in outstanding student loan debt over the last several years. This chart actually is from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and it shows the total amount of student loan debt outstanding from 2003 through 2012, first quarter. And from about 2005, in 2005 in the first quarter, there was $364 billion in student loan debt outstanding. 7 years later, in 2012 first quarter, there was $964 billion in student loan debt out. And in the last 3 years, student loan debt outstanding has increased by about 36%. If we put that in percentage terms, that's about 13% annual growth every year. This has happened while, as Martha mentioned, the amount is bigger than outstanding credit card debt or auto loan debt. So we're talking about a lot of debt here. And it's happened at the same time that since the third quarter of 2008, kind of in the peak of the recession period, total personal debt has decreased by $1.5 trillion. So that's a trend that's going in a very different direction than other forms of personal debt. And then there's been a lot of growth in student loan lending. You can see from this chart here that I don't have these labeled well, but the light blue line there near the top is subsidized Stafford, and the dark blue line is unsubsidized Stafford. There's been huge growth in Stafford loans, people borrowing Stafford loans. This is the annual student lending. Other federal loans would include things like Perkins loans. There has been some decline in private student lending, but there have, in general, been a lot of increases in student loan borrowing. When we hear about that increase in outstanding student loan debt, that in itself sounds like a big crisis, and it is something that we should be concerned about. But one thing we have to keep in mind is that a significant part of that, definitely a majority of that, has come from an increase in the number of borrowers. So it's not so much that people are individual borrowers are borrowing more and more larger amounts, but it's the number of borrowers are increasing. There are a lot of reasons for that, some of which I discuss in the paper. Again, I don't have time to go into a lot of details, but one of them is simply the increase in enrollments. And then another factor that Martha mentioned is simply that the cost of higher education is going up rapidly relative to inflation in general. So if we ask ourselves what the problem is, it comes down to capacity to pay. There's a lot of issues around that, and then the potential fiscal burden. Even though there's most of that increase is coming from the number of borrowers, there has still been some moderate increase in average debt. So that is something that we want to keep our eye on. And I noticed that a lot of the data that I use is from Equifax. It's data on student loan or credit reports of both student loan borrowers and non-borrowers. Don't worry, I can't identify any of you in the data set. All that information is stripped away. But it's a very unique data set that allows us to find out information about student loan borrowers that we've not ever been able to know before. And that data does show a fairly significant increase in the average amount borrowed in the last year or two. So the big issue for individual borrowers, and a lot of the report does focus on the situation for individual borrowers, is the the capacity to repay and the burden of that debt on the individual. This isn't students who just graduated. This is borrowers, anybody who has an outstanding student loan. Again, it comes from credit report data. And the average is widely reported in the press. It's $24,218. The median, however, is less than $14,000. So that's still a lot of debt, but it sizes the problem at a little lower level than we might often think about. The difference between the median and average is rather big. And the reason for that is there are a number of people who are at the high end of that distribution pulling the average up. So in fact, there are 3% of the people, at least in our Equifax data set, which this is 5% of the whole population. It's millions and millions of observations. I think it's very accurate. 3% of student loan borrowers have debt over $100,000. And obviously that is a huge burden. That's mortgage level burden for student loans. And 0.5% actually have debt over $200,000. And there were people one of the interesting things to do is kind of take a random sample of the Equifax data and look at individual borrowers. There were some people who had debt levels that I just couldn't imagine, well above even $200,000. By comparison, average mortgage debt was about $52,000. So these are pretty substantial debts. That $52,000, that's across people, even those who don't have mortgages. If we just looked at people with mortgages, it's about $150,000. Some widely reported information from the New York Fed recently is that only 40% of borrowers are under 30 and a third are over 40. Most of those people over 40, we haven't done a lot of analysis about this, but we got to remember that there's people with plus loans, for example, for their children. There are people who went to school, the kind of non-traditional students who went later. There are some people who certainly have paid loans over a long period of time, but there's a lot of factors that come into play there. I've got a lot of information in the report about state-to-state differences, and I really don't have time to go into a lot of details on that right now, but the one thing I wanted to point out was that across states, the numbers can be extraordinarily different. So in Wyoming has the lowest average, this is the average debt per student at $15,000. There's a lot of reasons for that. The University of Wyoming is the only four-year institution in Wyoming that has relatively low tuition and fees. They have a very generous state financial aid program in Wyoming. The highest is DC. The number is so high, and actually DC is relatively small with my 5% sample. So I'm not reporting an exact figure, but it's in the 30s. And there's a lot of reasons why that might be the case too. So for example, there are a lot of young professionals from very expensive schools, for example, in Washington. There's a number of other reasons too, and I explain that in the paper. One of the kind of newest items in the report is some information on the credit profile of student loan borrowers. So what do they look like in terms of all of their credit conditions, not just student loans? Well, the first thing that pops out is that total personal debt is quite a bit higher for student loan borrowers at $83,000 than it is for non-student loan borrowers at $66,000. But if you look at it, the difference is the student loan debt. So if we subtract off that student loan debt, they actually borrow less in terms of their total personal debts than do non-student loan borrowers. And one thing we have to keep in mind, of course, is that the demographic profile of the student loan borrower looks different. So they are typically younger than the general population. And so associated with that are some differences in incomes. And there's a lot of factors going on there, but and I don't want to suggest that it's only student loans. But the numbers suggest that there isn't a tremendous amount of borrowing in other ways by student loan borrowers, and also that there's not really low borrowing either, so it's not as if they're being prevented from borrowing any kind of other money. And then the revolving debt is very similar. One of the more I don't want to say surprising, but one of the numbers that really struck me is that the credit scores of student loan borrowers is much lower than it is for non-student loan borrowers. And this is enough of a difference to make a big difference in whether you get credit or what kind of interest rate you're going to pay on those loans. And There's a number of reasons there too. That again, there's this younger cohort with less lengthy credit histories and so forth, but there's a lot of delinquency rate. The delinquency rates are high for student loans, and that's certainly affecting the credit scores for that cohort. So that's definitely something to think about as we're designing policies going forward. Student loan delinquencies are very high relative to other forms of unsecured debt. Currently, as I've estimated, 10.6% of student loans are past due. So of everybody who has a student loan, 10.6% of those loans are past due. Of those, almost all of them are over 120 days past due. Okay, and the New York Fed actually did some matching up of borrowers over time, and looked at what if we exclude all these people who are in deferment or forbearance, and then they find that about more than a quarter of people who are in active repayment of student loans are delinquent on those accounts. So obviously that's a big problem. In the report, I talk in some detail about what the consequences are of delinquency. I think most of us are very familiar with a lot of those. But in student loans, they seem to be particularly severe compared to if one has a credit card, for example, that one is delinquent on. For example, one can have wages garnished, tax refunds intercepted. You can be prevented from getting a professional license. You can't get any more money for college if you want to continue or finish your education. So there's a whole host of problems there that I can't really get into details today. Again, that varies significantly across states. In Oklahoma, 18.5% of all student loans are delinquent. And there's a number of reasons for that too. I use Oklahoma as a case study in the paper. One of the reasons is there's a lot of disproportionate number of community college students in Oklahoma, and while I agree with the speakers this morning that that's an absolutely critical part of our higher education system, I'd like to see more resources go into community colleges actually. But at the same time, we have to recognize that borrowers from community colleges, for a number of reasons, are more likely to default, and in Oklahoma that contributes. Also in Oklahoma, there's one organization that services a substantial number of the loans, over a majority of the loans, that isn't very generous with forbearance and deferment and so forth, so that's contributed there. So there are a lot of state-specific factors that can come into play and make a big difference. Default rates, that can happen after 120 days late, certainly after 270%. This is when all those problems come in, especially in terms of garnishment and so forth, and you can't bankrupt student loans. There are cases where you can. They're very limited. The cohort default rate is 8.8% in the latest data that are available. Cohort default rate is the number of people who start repayment in a fiscal year and default by the end of the next fiscal year. So this is 8.8% of those. If we look at lifetime default rates, they're of almost 25% for people with subsidized Stafford loans. They're a little less than that for unsubsidized Stafford loans, and about 10% for PLUS loans. So if we look over the lifetimes, we get a very different picture. The number of issues, how much time? Oh, okay. I'm out of time. I will say on the fiscal impact, I'll have to leave you to see the report for that, but it turns out that by the government's accounting, they actually profit from the student loan programs. If we use kind of more widely accepted accounting principles, then the cost is about 11% of lending, which is about 0.4% of the federal budget. So it doesn't seem to be a burning issue right now in terms of the fiscal impact, but with different kinds of reform options that are being discussed, that could of course change in the future. So I appreciate your time.
Hello, everyone. I would like to thank Martha for her introduction and just thank you in general for having me here today. I'm thrilled to be here. I need to give the same caveat that Kelly did, that my views do not necessarily represent the views of my office. But I want to talk to you today about a couple of issues, and I will be brief, which everybody knows when a lawyer says that. You can't always hold them to it, but I'm going to do my best. The first is our office's lawsuit against Westwood College, which is a for-profit college here in Illinois. The second is an investigation that our office conducted along with several other states against a website called www.gibill.com, and the settlement that we were able to reach with the company that owns that website called Quinn Street. After I talk about the lawsuit and the investigation, I'm going to talk briefly about what's come out of both of those in terms of larger issues that we see with student loans. And then I'll talk very briefly about the time I spent on the negotiated rulemaking committee. So I will start with our office's lawsuit against Westwood. So on January 18th of this year, our office sued Westwood College for engaging in deceptive practices that left Chicago area students with up to $70,000 each in debt for degrees that failed to qualify them for certain careers in criminal justice. Westwood has, as I mentioned, 4 Illinois campuses, the DuPage campus, the Loop campus, the O'Hare campus, and the River Oaks campus. We filed suit in Cook County alleging violations of the Illinois Consumer Fraud and Deceptive Business Practices Act. Our investigation led us to focus on Westwood's criminal justice program, and what we found was that Westwood falsely convinced students they could pursue a law enforcement career with agencies such as the Chicago Police Department, the Illinois State Police, and certain suburban police departments, even though those employers did not recognize a Westwood degree due to its lack of regional accreditation. Many of the students that we talked to learned only after graduation and after taking on significant student debt in the form of both federal, private, and institutional or in-house loans offered by Westwood, that their degrees would not help them out and help them achieve the law enforcement jobs that they had originally sought to get. Also, because Westwood is not regionally accredited, it was more difficult for students to transfer their credits to other colleges. That was an issue some students asked about up front regarding transferability of credits, and some students were told that transferability of credits would in fact be easier than it was. We also allege, and I think this is a particularly interesting aspect of our investigation, that the college alleged in deceptive online advertising. Westwood regularly promoted its criminal justice program not just on television and radio ads, but also online by purchasing certain search terms in order to, display results. If a student typed in, "How do I become a Chicago police officer?" What are the educational requirements? And what we found is that Westwood purchased search terms such as regionally accredited colleges, become a police officer in Chicago, and state trooper college. When users searched for those terms, links to Westwood College would appear at the top of their search engine results, giving the false impression, we allege, that Westwood was regionally accredited and recognized by agencies including the Chicago Police Department and the Illinois State Police. Just to clarify, in order to be employed with the Illinois State Police, you need a bachelor's degree from a regionally accredited college. We also allege in the lawsuit that Westwood downplayed the ultimate total cost of attending the college and failed to provide students, and I'll come back to this in the summary, with sufficient information about their loan options. Westwood is typically more expensive than community colleges or state universities offering similar degrees. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Westwood, when federal loans and private loans would top out, as happened almost inevitably when the degree cost $70,000, students would finance the remainder. It was usually a fairly small loan, maybe $2,000 to $5,000, with Westwood's in-house loan program, which was called the Apex program, and had an interest rate as high as 18%. Westwood has moved to dismiss the Illinois Attorney General's lawsuit. That motion is fully briefed, and we are awaiting a ruling. I'll move on to talk about the GIBill.com investigation and settlement. So in June of this year, our office joined several other states announcing a settlement with Quinn Street, the company I mentioned earlier, a California-based company which owned www.gibill.com. And my understanding is that people here have heard a lot about the GI Bill, what it means in terms of the great deal of funding that's gone into it, and how for certain calculations, in particular the 90-10 rule, GI Bill funds do not count towards that 90%. So many for-profit colleges go after GI Bill money in order to help themselves out with the 90-10 ratio. So when you would go on GIBill.com, what you'd find would be a picture of, and I wish I had it, of a soldier in uniform, an American flag, and the tag phrase, "because you earned it." And then right below it, it would say, "find the right school for you." And there'd be a drop-down menu. The only colleges in the drop-down menu would be for-profit colleges. And then the site offered several other options for searching for a college that would be right for you with your GI Bill funding. Not all of the colleges that came up, but almost all of the colleges that came up were for-profit schools. So we were concerned about the fact that this website came across, given the insignia it used and the photos it used, as perhaps a government-sanctioned website, when in fact schools paid for placement on the site itself. What we were able to do is to talk to Quinn Street, come to a settlement, and the URL, www.gibill.com, has now been transferred to the Department of Veterans Affairs. So they now hold that link, and it is an official government website. Just one moment. And just a few other points quickly about that GIBill.com investigation. In addition to the turning over of the URL, which we thought was a tremendous achievement, Quinn Street also needs to shut down social media accounts associated with that website. They had a Twitter feed, they had a Facebook page. Those had to go away. Quinn Street owns some other military-related websites, and we agreed during the settlement that they would make clear and conspicuous disclosures regarding the fact that the search results potential students were seeing were paid for, were advertisements of some type. And also we wanted to ensure that on the other websites Quinn Street owned that provided information about GI Bill benefits, that they provided a link, a prominently displayed link, to the Veterans Affairs website, which included a full list of all schools that would accept GI Bill funding. So that's just a quick overview of that investigation. Now I'm going to summarize briefly with respect to that lawsuit and that investigation some general observations that have come out of both of those related to student loans. We've seen parallels during the courses of our lawsuit and investigations into the subprime mortgage market, which obviously our office has done work in that area. In particular, around 2008, as has been mentioned earlier, with respect to student loans, private lenders left the market, or virtually abandoned the market. And so institutional loans, like the Apex loan I mentioned earlier, stepped in or increased, the number of those loans increased to fill the gap. What we found when we talked to students is that there was a great deal of confusion, not only on the institutional loans, but on the federal and private loans about what type of loan they were taking out. It was very difficult for them to understand that. And there were issues regarding how financial aid officers presented that information. In some instances, students felt that they were rushed through that process, that they were told, this is all just paperwork, go ahead and sign, which is a pretty significant thing to say when you're talking about $70,000. So that came across very clearly as students were communicating to us. And one specific example of that is with the Apex loan. Students were told, you'll be making a $150 payment on that loan while you are in school, and this is a 3-year program. Some students thought that meant that when they graduated, that loan would be gone, that they wouldn't have any remaining balance. And then they were quite surprised to find out once they graduated and got their first statement that indeed they did still have a loan and that it had an 18% interest rate. In general, what we've found is that many of the students we talk to are the first in their family to go to college, and that we think it's vitally important for those students to have access to as much information as possible as early as possible. And I'm sure you all have already talked about the Know Before You Owe worksheet that has been released, and we think that that's fantastic and a great way for students to start learning what they need to know before they make this very important life decision. One thing I want to make sure to say is that it is not in any way true that all for-profit schools are bad actors. The degrees that students can get at all post-secondary institutions, including for-profit schools, whether they're certificate programs, associates, bachelor's programs, they can enhance employment opportunities and lead to higher income. So this is not, kind of painting with a broad brush by any means. But what we really, I think, feel strongly about is that students, as I mentioned, need to get good information up front so that they can make the best decision possible, have the best chance of graduating, and then, because they've done the research beforehand, gotten the information and determined that the program is a good fit for them, when they graduate, they're able to get a job in their field, which then results in, a good outcome for everyone. And one way I personally like to think about this, because I think it frames the issue in an interesting way, is a return on investment for the student. The student needs to know, what am I going to get out of putting $70,000 into this degree? It is an investment on the student's part, and they are, to the extent possible, entitled to know what their return is going to be. So very briefly, I will now conclude by talking about my participation in the Negotiated Rulemaking Committee, really, really quickly. 2 seconds? Okay. So, Negotiated Rulemaking Committee was, it was great, a great process to be a part of. We dealt with many different student loan issues. One in particular that myself and another gentleman, Todd Leatherman, who is also an Assistant Attorney General from Kentucky, were involved in drafting and negotiating, was the closed school discharge rule, which I will not get into now. And we very much, I just do want to say at the end, we very much enjoyed the opportunity to work with the Department of Education and with other stakeholders on these very important issues. So we appreciated it. Okay, thanks.
And I will say that we enjoyed working with Michelle and her colleagues. From my perspective, I love and hate negotiated rulemaking. What I love about it is when we have great allies and co-producers of our regulations, and we can't do as well without the support of folks like Michelle. I wanted to spend a little time with you today just sharing a little information that came out of our gainful employment work. We released some gainful employment data a couple of weeks ago, and some of it has bearing, a significant bearing, I think, on conversations about affordability and debt, particularly when we think about it in the kind of the way that Michelle ended, which is think about it in terms of return on investment. Remember what our concerns were back when we were developing our program integrity regulations, including gainful employment. And I will say, for me, the biggest concern was what we saw in terms of graduation rates. We saw graduation rates in some sectors falling off a cliff. Overall, they were kind of flat, but particularly in four-year for-profit institutions, they fell off a cliff, and over a decade-long period, from being in the mid-60s to being about 20%. And so we stopped and we started looking at a range of concerns, misrepresentation, incentive compensation, and one that kind of latched in everybody's mind and kind of caught people's attention because everybody said you can't do that, was gainful employment. And so I should have to talk a minute about the legal status of gainful employment regulations. The district court in the District of Columbia on June 30th did issue a ruling in which he vacated most of the gainful employment regulations. The court found that we had a strong policy rationale for our regulations, but we lacked sufficient grounding in the setting of one threshold related to repayment rate, and so the court vacated most of those provisions. But the court did leave in place the disclosure requirements, and I should say also that we have filed a motion. The Justice Department's filed a motion to reinstate some of the additional requirements in our regulations related to reporting, because they are critical and essential to the disclosure requirements. We put out a statement at the time of the decision where we acknowledged the court's acceptance of our policy rationale for the regs overall, but did express our concerns about the striking of the thresholds. So we did release informational rates. This kind of just gives you the flow of the data from institutions to the Social Security Administration, where we got earnings information at a program level that we then turned into median, earnings, which resulted in debt to earnings ratios, and we calculated repayment rates. This chart is important only when you look at the far right corner, which says that we assess the debt to earnings ratios at 3,695 programs at 1,300 institutions, and that was out of a total of about 27,000 gainful programs that are subject to gainful employment requirements under the statute. Most of the other programs are, well, all the other programs are small, fewer than 30 completers, and so lots of programs that didn't have very many completers, but we're able to measure about 4,000 of those. This provides information about repayment rates. The important thing to note is in each of the columns, the one at the far right are institutions with repayment rates between, the number of institutions between 0 and 15% repayment rates. There was one institution with a 3.41% repayment rate. 4.31% repayment rate, and that's important because we gave everybody 3 for free. We said, well, we know that overall about 1.5% of our program repayers are in income-based or income-sensitive repayment, and so we'll double that and give everybody that as a floor, and one institution had a particularly low rate. But we are concerned about repayment rates when they get down below that 35% threshold we had set that the courts had issues with. But you can see the distribution there. This is a distribution of debt to earnings using annual earnings. Again, the far right are the groups of programs that we're concerned about. Those that had debt to earnings based on annual income over 12%. And this is discretionary income, showing those kind of as a background to what I'm going to show you next. And what I'm going to show you next is a series of slides that take and do scatter plots that look at discretionary debt to earnings on one axis and then repayment rates on another. And I'm doing this, and I'm going to do this kind of quickly because it's for effect. It's not for you to get particular numbers from it, but just to see the pattern here. So this is for undergraduate certificates, and if you note on the far left-hand side and above that dark red line down at 35% or so, that is the quadrant that we express concerns about in our regs, where we describe those, and I'll use this in quotes, failing programs. And so that far left quadrant and above the red line is the group that we're concerned about. And you'll notice it's pretty densely packed over there on in that quadrant for the undergraduate certificate programs. This is for associate's degree programs. Still pretty densely packed. It's getting a little bit less dense in that bad quadrant. And in point of fact, it's shifting to the right. You know, the density is going from the far left and it's starting to move to the right. Now this is bachelor's degrees, and you see that quadrant that has been that I said was of concern has now only has one program in it. So at bachelor's degree levels, even though these individuals are taking on more debt, they're able to carry that debt, shifting to the right, because their earnings have increased. And when we get to the associate's degrees and bachelor's degrees, we're talking about only for-profit programs. So to Michelle's point, there are programs that are performing very well against these metrics, that are return on investment metrics. Look down in there at the far right-hand side. You see a cluster of programs that have repayment rates in the 80% range, and where you see debt earnings ratios below 10%. These are programs that are returning to the students that they served well against their investment. And again, graduate and professional programs, again, got a couple of programs that are kind of outliers in that group that fail. They're interesting programs. I encourage you to look at the data. It's all public and see what they are, but it's very interesting. And again, we've got some programs, even at this level, where their students are incurring a lot more debt, where the earnings are sufficient for them to keep a low debt-to-earnings ratio when we repay their loans. So we see some really significant positives coming out of this data, as well as some negatives, including even where people have income. There are some programs where they're for some reason not repaying their loans. Michelle made a mention of criminal justice. I didn't know she was going to mention criminal justice when I did the slides, but when you think about criminal justice, these are programs that start at the undergraduate certificate level and go all the way up to the graduate level. The interesting thing about this chart is, despite that fact, this chart for criminal justice programs looks awful much like the one for undergraduate certificates. So within some majors, you see the problems that you see for undergraduate certificates and associate's degrees. This data is very rich. I encourage people to use it, look at it, analyze it. I've only had a few hours of spare time when Martha has me doing nothing else to look at this data. It's really very interesting. I have said to people there are a couple of 20, 30, 40 graduate theses in this data. Just with a few hours of looking at it, I have drawn that conclusion. I wanted to mention our repayment plan issues. One of the things that's really important for you to remember is that this administration is committed to making it easier for students to repay their loans. The president announced pay as you earn last fall. Our negotiating committee on student loans helped us write regulations that we publish as an NPRM, and with public comments period ending next week, so that we'll be able to have people repay their loans under an income contingent repayment plan where the payments are going to be capped at 10% of discretionary income, where the loans will be forgiven after 20 years and not 25 years under our current repayment programs. And this kind of work in terms of our regulatory work would not have moved forward as fast as it did if there wasn't a commitment across the whole community in support of it, and with the great help of our negotiating committee that concluded their work in March. Have to talk about the issue that Arnie raised, and Michelle may mention this too. We want to make it really easier for families to understand the obligations their students are taking on. It's critically important that they understand from the very beginning of the process how much students are going to need to take out in terms of debt, and we're working on a range of consumer choice tools that help in that. The most important one that not released yet is our college scorecard that will come to you in September. We're working on finalizing the design of that now and look forward to that being released in September. But we did release a financial aid shopping sheet. Really important here is that makes sure that students understand the information about the outcomes of their educational experience in terms of graduation rates and repayment rates, in this case default rates, and median income, median debt for graduate programs. We think that this is probably the most important thing we can do right now, is help students be better informed about the choices they're making and the debt that's associated with those choices. We think that that's critical to making sure that our students are fully informed and in best position to make good decisions. So that.
Thank you, David.
So there was a lot of interesting information there. I want to commend Shio for putting this together. These are three really disparate sets of information and insights, but I'm just going to try to take a few minutes and pull together some of the key ideas that I think come out of this. First, the obvious question, why is this a big topic? Because, as Kelly said, every day you read about the student debt crisis. And also, as he said, it is very much exaggerated in terms of what you read. I'm not such an optimist. I'm a little bit more cynical. I do think it is on purpose. I don't think it's unintentional. I think that, journalists have real interest in doing this. And so that makes all the information that's presented here much more important, because it allows us to think a little bit more analytically about what the issues are. And there are some very real problems, and the fear is that this focus on $1 trillion and student loan debt being greater than credit card debt diverts us from thinking about the very real problems that certain students in certain circumstances face, some of which we've just heard about. The credit card issue is one of my pet peeves, because obviously we could do away with student loans and let everybody put school on their credit cards, and then credit card debt would be higher and student loan debt would be lower, and no one would be better off, right? So it's not real. That's really not the issue. I was happy talking to Kelly earlier to hear him say that really the fiscal impact, that we should not be panicked about this. This is not so big in terms of an impending fiscal crisis. But individual students are really struggling, and we have to try to figure out why, and we have to figure out who are those outliers and why. That difference between the mean and the median debt is very significant. One of the issues is the difference between the temporary circumstances that are causing students problems and the permanent circumstances that are causing them problems. So we're in a bad economy, and we sincerely hope and believe that the unemployment rate, and particularly the unemployment rate for recent college students, is going to go down. We have to do something to make sure that they can get through this period of time without having their lives ruined, their financial lives or any other part of their lives. But that doesn't mean that this is a permanent student loan problem. On the other hand, some of the circumstances that students face are permanent. Students who graduate or go to school in the circumstances that Michelle is talking about, assuming that the allegations against Westwood College are correct, these students have long-term problems, and the economy recovering is not going to solve their problems. And the low completion rates are a problem. We have to treat those problems differently. The solutions are different than the solutions to the temporary problems of the economy. And clearly, one of the big problems, as David pointed out, is information. Students need much better information. They are making choices that they don't have to make, that make their circumstances much worse, and information can help solve those problems. On the other hand, there are real structural barriers, and for many students, that they don't have a choice. There are no good options for them, and we have to differentiate between those things. One of the big headlines these days is about default rates, and I think it's really interesting, that graph that we saw of default rates over time. If you noted that in 1989, 1990, it was 22%, okay? So it's not anywhere near that now. And what did we do? we made it so that schools with very high default rates are ineligible to participate in the student loan programs. And the question is, how come we were able at that time to do that? A lot of fly-by-night for-profits went out of business, and now look at the difficulty we're having when we're trying to do something pretty similar with gainful employment. And interestingly, I haven't heard people conjure that up, that historical parallel, in this discussion. So really, we have to figure out how to get this gainful employment process on track. I was thinking in the decision, they cited this study that I co-authored about appropriate debt-to-income ratios as justification. There was a rationale for those numbers, but the 35% repayment rate was pulled out of the sky, so I just need to write a paper about that, and then maybe we can have it get through. I don't know. I mean, it's a little crazy. Anyway, so I think that pursuing this gainful employment issue is really important. Maybe this is an opportunity to do some regrouping. I mean, the political issues here are just huge, and really the rules as written don't have enough teeth in them. And one of the issues is I was really interested in seeing the number of programs there. Maybe there are a lot of small programs, but I bet schools are going to be very good at making their programs smaller so that they won't be in there. So we really do have to do something with that to make sure that we tackle these problems. Another big issue that I think is a permanent issue in the sense of the permanence that I was talking about before is the private student loans, and I don't think we should think that the private student loan market has gone away. My personal opinion is that there shouldn't be private student loans. If you want to take an unsecured private consumer loan, we can't stop you, but people think that they're taking a student loan like a federal student loan, and there's no reason for us to actually sanction that. We have to worry about completion. I think we should we know that not completing is a strong predictor of defaulting, having trouble with your student loans, and we all need to be cautious about this tension that's out there now in the community, which is don't talk about completion, because if you talk about completion, you're destroying access. And I think that's a really dangerous discussion, because we have to be talking about access to something. We're not doing students any favor just to throw money at them, let them waste their time and accumulate debt if they're not completing. And finally, in terms of information, I think that the information issue is huge, but we have to be very careful because students need financial information. They need to know the payoff to their degree, but they need to know they're not only going to school for money, and that looking for the cheapest option might not help. Look at the Massachusetts study that just came out today, was just in the news today, showing that students in Massachusetts who accepted these merit scholarships to stay in Massachusetts, and they could have gone to better schools and graduated, and they stayed and went to less competitive schools, spent less, didn't graduate on time. So we want to be careful about that information, but information is obviously very important. So those are all the big problems that are staying with us. I think that the problems for the economy and the problems that students face temporarily, the income-based repayment program, and the efforts to make it stronger are really important. But here I would say that I don't actually think reducing the percentage of your discretionary income that you have to pay from 15% to 10% is going to solve anybody's problem, because if you can pay something out of your discretionary income, if you could have paid, if you can pay 10%, you're not the target audience here. And I know that this is something we can do because it's not very expensive. We need to worry about the people who have difficulty getting into income-based repayment. We need to worry about how loans, the interest accrues, and so they owe 3 times as much as they borrowed. There are things we need to do to improve income-based repayment, and I appreciate the efforts, but I don't think that the 10% is going to solve the problem. So I think putting together all the things that people have said here gives us a really important look at student loans. Our students need loans. Student loans increase access, they increase opportunities, and for most students they're fine, but this discussion highlights some of the severe problems that certain types of students in certain circumstances are facing. Thanks.